I am delighted and honored to be able to introduce to you our plenary session for this afternoon, Barbara Lundblad. And you have a couple of comments about her, biographical comments about her in your program, but I want to add a few other things that have been really remarkable about Barbara and wanted to share with you. One of the things that you need to know about Barbara is she has contributed to so many different publications with her sermons and with her writings, the lectionary homiletics, Currents in Theology and Mission, Word and World, the Journal of Preaching, and the Living Pulpit, just all over the place, and so grateful for her wisdom and her words to us preachers. She also was the recipient last year at our Academy of Homiletics meeting, which is the guild of preachers, people who teach preaching. And we gather every year around Thanksgiving time. And last year at our guild, she was the recipient of our Lifetime Achievement Award. So. Barbara holds a very special place in my heart that I need to share with you. There are not very many Lutheran women teaching preaching. In fact, right now, because of Barbara's retirement, I am one of 3. And she has always been one whom we looked up to, who we wanted to be, we idolized. She was our mentor. And it's hard to imagine what the landscape of Lutheran preaching would look like without her influence these past years. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Lundblad.
Just a moment here. Well, I forgot my name tag today. I spent the whole morning trying to figure out what to wear, Carolyn. And I just want to show you that I do have a waist, and there it is. But I can also tell you that if I wore Caroline Lewis's shoes, you would see a body on the ground instead. So it's great to be here, and I'm aware that now all the black speakers have gone. So, you're left with the white people up here. And it's one of the things I want to talk about, but I think many of us may be feeling, including myself, we're going to go home tomorrow, and we're going to say, boy, Otis Moss, fantastic. Luke Powery, did you hear that singing? Oh. Teresa Fry Brown last night, boy, she had shoes too. I couldn't wear her shoes either, but now I think that some of us at least are saying, I could never do that. I could never do that. Not in my congregation. And I want to say a word about what it's like to preach when nobody wants to hear our song. You may know the name of Anna Quindlen. She is a novelist, but before she was a novelist, she wrote columns for newspapers, op-ed columns, and they were really wonderful. I wish she were still doing it. And more than once, she took us to a daycare center in Jersey City called the Caring Place. It was a daycare center for the homeless children whose families had moved from place to place to place, and the Caring Place became really home to them. And one day, the sisters, the Roman Catholic sisters who ran this daycare center, took the children to the ocean. They had never been outside of Jersey City. And they scrambled up these high dunes, and then they saw before them more water than they had ever seen. I think some of them were afraid, But some of them just tumbled down that sand dune and ran to touch that water. They raced the waves that touched their toes. They played in the water. And then soon it was time for them to go to lunch. And after lunch they said, "Sister, sister, can we go back to that water?" And so the sisters said, "Yes, we'll go back there." And one little boy climbed up the dunes. I mean, these must have looked like mountains to them. Climbed up the dune and looked out, and then he turned around and said to the others, "It's still there." Imagine. So many things had disappeared in his young life that he thought maybe even the ocean could disappear over lunch. Well, we're older, we're wiser, we know that the ocean isn't going to disappear. I know that, I have every confidence of it, even though I don't live anymore near the ocean. But we do feel ourselves scrambling to find a place that will hold. Now, I told this story some years ago in a sermon, 1994, at the Reforming Church gathering over in Minneapolis. We held that conference. It was called a free conference. I don't think it was free, but I mean, it wasn't sponsored by any official Lutheran group, but I think people had to pay to go. It was 1 year, almost exactly, after the Reimagining Conference held at the Minneapolis Convention Center. And almost 1 year, exactly, after the first sexuality statement of the ELCA was released to the press before pastors saw it. Those of us, the women who were involved in reimagining, were spared the violent vitriol that descended on many, many women, because all of the people that would have been angry at us were so angry about the sexuality statement that it took them about 6 months to catch up, and then we heard it too. You're a work of the devil. Women lost their jobs. Women didn't get calls. I have every confidence that the reason we have 10 settings of the ELW, not one of them with expansive language to include language about women, has something to do with the Reimagining Conference of 1993. Because people were so terrified about a conference that had female language for God. We're afraid. We're afraid of so many things. We're scrambling up the sandy dunes trying to find a place that will hold us. Shore up the borders. Build a high wall to keep out immigrants. And if possible, get Mexico to pay for it. No more of those anchor babies. Terrible phrase, isn't it? Shore up our borders. Shore up our streets. Make us safer by allowing guns to be carried in every public place, including college campuses, national parks, even churches. And by all means, keep the death penalty legal. Shore up the family. Find a way to upend the Supreme Court decision about gay marriage by passing a constitutional amendment that will indeed define marriage between one man and one woman. Shore up my life. I'm working 2 jobs. I can't pay the mortgage. My house is underwater still. And even if we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, do you know what kind of salary that really is, especially if I have no health care? How do we preach when people are so afraid, including us? How do we have the courage to preach when people don't want to hear our song? Hush, hush, somebody's gonna be mad. How do we preach when it's hard? I preached for 17 years at Union Theological Seminary in James Chapel. It wasn't so very hard. Everybody there wanted to hear a word about social justice, systemic evil, economic globalization. I had a hard time keeping up. But I know that you don't preach always in congregations like that. How do we preach an assuring word all the time, knowing that's what people want to hear? They don't come to church to hear about politics. How do we preach the blues in such a place? Last night, Teresa Fry Brown said that her passion for preaching is social justice. And I've heard Teresa preach, and that is her passion, and she preaches it. But Michael Brown also told us a very moving story about a woman whose little daughter was going to face surgery the next morning after the church service. She probably didn't want to hear about the death penalty. How do we have the courage to preach when people don't want to hear our song? And not just our personal song, I mean the song we feel that God has given us to preach. I think we are called to preach a transforming word about people's personal lives. Later, I will say a word about our corporate lives, but our personal lives. You may know Doug Marlette's cartoons about a fictional preacher that he calls Reverend Will B. Dunn. He's a southern cartoonist, maybe hasn't gotten this far north. But one of his cartoons, Reverend Dunn is standing in the pulpit, and I've updated it a little bit, but here's how it goes. Brothers and sisters, he says, we got to be willing to give up all this drinking. Amen, they say. And smoking. Amen. And carrying on. Amen. Yes, sir, we got to be willing to give up those newfangled sharp smartphones. Silence. There's a bubble over his head that says, I think I touched a nerve. Last Sunday we had the text about divorce and remarriage and adultery and children. Lots there. I don't know what you preached. But we seldom hear sermons about adultery. I know when we were doing the sexuality study on the second time around in the congregation I served in New York, a wonderful man in the congregation came up to me and he said, why don't we ever talk about why people commit adultery? He said, somebody doesn't just get up in the morning and say, I think I'm going to commit adultery today. He said, what? He was really talking about from his own experience. What is it that draws somebody away from a relationship into another? Maggie Wenig, who is now the first vice president of the Academy of Homiletics that Caroline talked about, she's very interested in this topic, and she sent out a questionnaire to all of the members of the Academy of Homiletics, these people who teach preaching, and asked, please send me a sermon that you have preached about adultery. Or if you haven't preached one, have you read a sermon about adultery? Not one response. She did get one response, a sermon from a former student who is now a congregational rabbi. She's still waiting for more people from the academy to respond. Some things seem too personal to speak from the pulpit. We're worried that children will turn to their mom and say, "What's adultery?" And we know that there are people in the congregation who have experienced adultery themselves. How do we preach about the real things that are going on in people's lives? I show a sermon to my students, I did when I was teaching. I showed a sermon that Otis Moss preached at Trinity called Sex in the City. At the end of that sermon, he called all the young people up, high school and middle school. You know, there were hundreds of kids. And then he said, "Now, I'm not going to ask you a question about your own life, but I just want to ask you, do you know somebody? Do you know somebody who has had an abortion? Do you know somebody who's been abused by their partner?" I mean, the list was long. It was very personal. I mean, he had given them permission not to answer for themselves. But I thought to myself, all the parents there are overhearing what their kids know, the lives their kids are living, if not themselves, their friends. How do we speak about the real things that are going on in people's lives? Because many people are indeed singing the blues. How do we preach about fidelity in relationships, about personal finances, about sexual ethics, about career decisions, about finance investments? How many of us imagine that we will preach on Tamar once a year, or maybe even once? Sometimes the courage we need is to break silence. Joy Bussard is a friend of mine who's a pastor in southern Minnesota now. And for a time, she worked for the Minnesota Council of Churches, and she did a lot of workshops around Minnesota about domestic violence. This was many, many years ago. And after, a couple weeks later, she ran into some of the pastors who were at these workshops, and they said to her, "Joy, you will not imagine what happened. The Sunday after I'd been at the workshop, I just said in my sermon, I was at a workshop on domestic violence. That's all that was said. And then this preacher said, you wouldn't believe it, but that very week, 2 women came to talk to me. The pastor had not even given a whole sermon about domestic violence, had not even said, I feel this way or that way about it, but silence had been broken. How can we have the courage to break silence about what's happening? I don't mean break confidence. That's a different thing altogether and should never happen. But how can we break the silence about the realities of people's lives, including men's lives? Sometimes a poem or a song gets through. I think country western songs are probably a really good source here. Text sample, a sociologist of religion says that seminarians listen to NPR. Most of the rest of the country listens to country western. So maybe we need to expand our repertoire. This is a poem by Barton Sutter, who lives, I think, still in Duluth. And it's based on a true story of the Chicago snowstorm of 1979. It's called The Snowman. This is a poem for Tom. This is a poem for Tom Blair. This is a poem for him and for all of the men on the edge of their beds in their underwear, wondering what they're doing there. This is a poem for them, for all of the good providers. Thomas Blair drove a plow, and because of the snow in '79, he worked a lot of overtime. Not that I blame the snow, but because of the snow, the work was there, and there was the wife and kid and a regular blizzard of debts. And so the food of the poem is coffee and cigarettes. Tom went to work, and he worked with little time off, and one day, he went berserk. He forgot all about the snow and started plowing up cars, and some had people in them, and some of the people died. Can you see the blue lights of his truck, the cherry tops of the cops? He wrecked 40 cars with the plow before they stopped him. And when they did stop him, when they could hear what the screaming was about, do you know what the screaming said? I hate my job. I want to see my kid. I hate my goddamn job. So that's it. That's the poem. What do you think? What do you think it's all about? It's not about the snow, so much as I'll tell you what it's about. This is a poem for Tom. This is a poem for Tom Blair. This is a poem for him and for all of the men on the edge of their beds in their underwear, wondering what they're doing there. This is a poem for them, for all of the good providers. Walter Brueggemann says that we are witnessing the collapse of white, straight, male hegemony. I don't know if it's true, but I surely don't know what men do with that. What do men do if they are convinced that they are part of a group that is falling out of power, that we are witnessing the fall of white, straight, male hegemony? What do Swedish Lutherans do when they sense that the word inclusive doesn't mean new translations of Scandinavian hymns? At the close of a church-wide assembly a number of years ago, I remember at the end of that assembly, someone can go to the microphone and ask for a point of personal privilege. And a bishop of the church, not the presiding bishop, but one of the synodical bishops, went to the microphone and he said, I have a point of personal privilege. Could we all rise and sing, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God"? Well, we hardly could sing the first verse, actually, from memory, because we only sing it once a year. But what he was saying is, we have been singing in Spanish, and we have been clapping, trying to get on the, not the first beat, but the second beat, and we've sung songs of South Africa, and really, I have not heard my song anywhere. So one of the things I think we need courage to do is to name the fears that are there. Because the fears unnamed are going to be unleashed on all kinds of people. Unleashed on gay and lesbian and transgender and bisexual people because we're afraid of our own sexuality. Surely unleashed on immigrants. I grew up when young people in my farming community detasseled corn. 50 cents an hour or something like that. No kid detassels corn now. It's all done by migrant workers in Iowa. Immigrants taking the jobs that we want? I don't think so. Not if you look at every packing plant town in the Midwest that has become almost overnight Spanish-speaking school. But when we are afraid, so afraid that things are changing. Remember those town hall meetings a few years ago? A woman came to the microphone at one of them and said, in tears, a woman who looked a lot like me, same age probably, "What has happened to my America? I want my America back." Fears, we need to name them and be real about people's lives. But we also need courage to speak about communal life. Communal, community, communion, all of them rooted in common. The common good has become indeed quite uncommon. In 1 Corinthians 12, before we get to that list of all those gifts, those spiritual gifts, the utterance of wisdom, faith, healing, working miracles, prophecy, various kinds of tongues, interpretation of tongues, and I suppose the OM3 translation might go, some have been given the gift of teaching Sunday school, to another singing in the choir, to another being an usher. Please bring forward your time and talent forms right now. Before that long list, we hear this from Paul. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Wow. The common good has become quite uncommon. How do we preach about the common good, of which we hopefully are all a part? It was wonderful when the Pope spoke before Congress. I mean, I have my own feelings about whether that should have happened, but what was wonderful is that the Golden Rule got a standing ovation. Do you remember that moment? He was speaking slowly, this man working so hard to learn English. Do unto others, and everybody stood up before he could even finish. I mean, Republicans and Democrats, as far as I could see, everybody in the House, and finally then he was able to say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A standing ovation for the Golden Rule. I think he was close to the Luke verse more than the Matthew 7 verse. And it's interesting to me that in Luke, the Golden Rule comes after this section. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, turn the other cheek, give away your coat, give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Wow. How does the Golden Rule sound specifically? It's lovely on a coffee mug or a refrigerator magnet. Do unto immigrants as you want immigrants to do unto you. Or treat transgender people as you would want them to treat you. Treat the homeless man sleeping on the park bench as you want him to treat you. It's easier to talk about a bumper sticker than to get specific about the Golden Rule. Once we start talking about these specifics, well, it starts to get really close to politics or economics. As my former colleague at Union is fond of saying, Cornell West, justice is what love looks like in public. Perhaps justice is what the Golden Rule looks like in public. We simply can't get away from the common good, from communal, from justice talk if we're going to preach on the Bible. Care for the widows and orphans. Leave grain at the edges of your field for those who are poor. Let justice roll down like waters. Bring the homeless poor into your house. Love your enemies. Feed the hungry. Clothe the naked. Welcome the stranger. Visit those in prison. Share possessions so there is not a needy person among you. Resist the powers of oppressive empire. And all of us could go on and on. Just hear the first reading for this coming Sunday. Seek the Lord and live, or he will break out against the house of Joseph like fire. Moving on to the 10th verse. They hate the one who reproves in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks the truth. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, or 80-story apartment buildings in New York City that start at $8 million and go up from there. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. The prophets always were speaking to a people rather than just one person. They were speaking to a community. How in the world do we hear that text where we are? How do we hear it in some kind of conversation with Mark 10 about the rich man who came to Jesus? I won't say more about that because that's a text for tomorrow, when I'm preaching tomorrow, and I don't want everything to happen now. But sometimes that can become a very personal story. You know, I watch too much TV. What do I have to give up? But not if you hear it in a conversation with Amos. Mary Boyes, who's done a lot of work in Jewish Christian conversation, says that rather than we shouldn't think of the Old Testament going into the New like a kind of linear line, like it gets really good and improved over here, the New rather than the Old. But we should see a conversational circle. I love that way she talks about it, that Amos has something to do with Mark 10, and we need to hear a conversation because Amos is unabashedly communal. And in this kind of preaching, which is really very hard, the Bible is a very present help in times of trouble. When our courage wanes, the Bible is our strongest ally. I say this even though I know in congregations there are many different ways of interpreting the Bible. Still, the Bible is our shared book. Those of us who follow the lectionary, whether the narrative lectionary or the Revised Common Lectionary, we can always say to people, well, that's what the text says. I didn't choose this. Now, that won't help always. Some congregations I know are eager to hear preaching on political, social, and economic issues. Some of you are pastors of those congregations. Last Sunday, after the terrible shooting in Oregon, people in those congregations wanted to hear the preacher say something about guns. Maybe that preacher took the end story about the children, where Jesus said, "Let the children come to me." This preacher knew that in that congregation there hardly were any members of the NRA. There weren't even people in the congregation who were hunters. That would have been true at Advent in New York City. I don't know of anybody who went hunting. So the preacher there could surely preach about gun safety and expand Jesus' words, "Let the children come to me. Keep them safe. Guard their lives. So when they go into the street, they will not be gunned down. When they go to class, they will not expect that somebody sitting next to them has a gun." That congregation would have been really receptive to that message. But not every congregation. There are some congregations, and perhaps congregations where you preach, where if you preach that sermon there, people might have walked out before the end. Now, this is the reality of where we're preaching. I think we can still find a place where there may be some common values, that we would work for common ground. That's not easy, because every person in the congregation might define the common good in a different way. Our goal is not to be prophetic heroes, but to open listeners to God's vision of the common good. When Otis talked about taking that piece of chalk and drawing in the windows and the doors to show a vision of what might be, I have a sense that even in a congregation filled with people who go hunting, there are common concerns for the well-being of our children. Now, some will say that's why I have a gun, to protect my children. But since we now have, as President Obama told us, in a very powerful word about this shooting, we now have one gun for every man, woman, and child in the United States, and we're not any safer at all. I like to think that people in a congregation filled with people who hunt are also concerned about the well-being of their community and their families. I think that we might lift up some possibilities there that would honor the common good that we have together. Well, I don't know that this is going to catch on really, but I think you could propose starting a group called Hunters Upholding Gun Safety. Hunters Upholding Gun Safety. Do you know? Hugs. Hugs. I don't know if it's going to catch on, but I think we could have t-shirts. I really mean it when I say that I know that many of you preach in congregations where it's very difficult to preach on political, economic, and social issues. Years ago, before Sam Brownback was governor of Kansas, he was a representative in the House of Representatives, and he gave a speech one day on the House floor, and he said, "Mr. Speaker, when I go back to Kansas and I talk to people in my district, and I ask them, are the issues that you're concerned about, are they moral or are they economic? And I'll tell you 9-1, people will say they're moral rather than economic." What's wrong with that picture? How did economic and moral get so divided that we can't talk about the morality of economics? Communal issues. There are so many. Some of them we will address because they're in the text. And we should not try to avoid it and say, I'm going to preach on the epistle. Some of them are community texts that we need to preach on because this is what people are thinking about, worrying about. When 9/11 happened in New York City, people had to preach about it, to say something about it, even though there was nothing to be said other than to lament. How lonely sits the city that once was filled with people. How lonely she has become. Sometimes you will just need to say, I'm going to step outside the lectionary because something has happened in our community. The shooting in Oregon, the death of too many black men at the hands of police. How do we, I'm really concerned about how we as, not everybody here is white, but how do we who are white, how do we have the courage to preach about race and racism in white congregations, like the place where I grew up, Gowrie, Iowa, Zion Lutheran Church. I love that church. But in our town, there was not a person of color. There was not a Jew. I mean, as far as we knew, there weren't any gay people, but I mean, if they were gay, I didn't even know at the time that I was gay, so how would I have, nobody said it at the time that I was growing up. So it was a perfectly white, straight world. How do we have the courage to preach about race and racism in congregations that are largely white? Last week, I was one of the speakers for the Minneapolis Area Synod, and the topic was the church and public voice. Truly, I was tempted to speak the same lecture here except Lewis was also there. So I said, this is not a good example for a former student. But we were meeting in small tables to respond to things, and one woman, a clergy woman, told this story. She said she had said the word racism in her sermon. I don't think she said much more about that other than the word. And after worship, a member of that congregation came up to her and said, I am leaving this church, and I am taking my $100,000 pledge to the Capitol campaign with me. He did not want to hear her song. So I have no illusions of what many of you are up against. People in white churches may indeed say, this doesn't affect us here, not in Gowrie, Iowa, not in you name the place, not even in a city where this city that I'm part of now, St. Paul and Minneapolis, has very few churches that are even multicultural in any way. So don't think it's just out there in the country. We know this has been a year of too much killing, and the minute that the signs went up and the hashtag began, Black Lives Matter, it did not take long for somebody to tweet and chant, all lives matter. We couldn't stand it. Judith Butler, in an interview in the New York Times, said this: when some people rejoin with all lives matter, they misunderstand the problem, not because their message is untrue. It is true that all lives matter, but it is equally true that not all lives are understood to matter, which is precisely why it is most important to name the lives that have not mattered. We have to foreground those whose lives that are not mattering now, to mark that exclusion. I think people in most congregations would say Black Lives Matter, but they would really like to say all lives matter, and they would like us as preachers to say all lives matter. What I know is that I want to maintain my innocence through all of this. Really. I want to be Atticus Finch. And now he has been taken away from us. Oh. My ancestors came from Sweden, and as far as I know, they sort of hopped over the East Coast and went to Minnesota and Iowa, and they never owned slaves. It's not my fault. It's not my fault that I'm white. Isabel Wilkerson is a wonderful, wonderful writer who wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's great migration of blacks from the South up to the North. She also wrote an essay this summer, right after the Confederate flag came down. One of the things I had never known is that the Confederate flag hadn't been up for years and years and years. It went up in 1961, not quite a year after To Kill a Mockingbird was published. I don't know if there was any convergence there at all. People didn't want to hear that message from To Kill a Mockingbird. Anyway, the Confederate flag went up, and we met Atticus Finch in 1960. I had a student named Atticus. Numbers of people named their sons Atticus. I mean, he wasn't even a real person, but somehow he became a real person, and I wanted to be Atticus Finch. I just saw the play at the Guthrie. Some of you probably have seen the movie. I wanted to be Atticus Finch when he walks out of the courtroom. If you remember that scene, The black people were all sitting up in the balcony. It's where they had to sit. And as Atticus Finch, after the trial, when Tom Robinson, the black man, had been acquitted, even though clearly he had been proved innocent, Atticus was walking out of the courtroom, and all of the black people in the gallery stood up. And then Reverend Sykes, the black minister, poked Scout, his little daughter. Jean Louise was her real name. And Reverend Sykes poked her and said, "Jean Louise, get up now. Your father's passing by." Wow. I wanted to be Atticus Finch, but I'm not. Now the Confederate flag has come down from the dome of the Capitol in South Carolina, and Atticus Finch, the elder, has been proved to be a racist. What Isabel Wilkerson asks us in her essay is this very important question: could the unmasking of the nation's mystical conscience, Atticus Finch, wake us up to the truth of who we have been all along, and help us to come to grips with an America that never was? We have needed so badly, she said, to get past the guilt and embrace what is true, and to find strength in that discovery. James Baldwin put it in these words: "To accept one's past, one's history, is not the same as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. Yeah? It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life, like clay in a season of drought." When we, as white people in mainly white congregations, talk about racism, more than anything, we need to stand with the people rather than over against them. We need to tell our story, and when race and racism became real in our own lives, when we realized that we had some privilege that black sisters and brothers simply did not have, like getting an FHA mortgage. 1935, FHA mortgages were available for people to get low-income loans, but hardly any black person could qualify for such a loan. Neighborhoods were zoned green or blue or black or yellow. I mean, if you lived in a certain neighborhood which was primarily African American, it was deemed an undesirable location to get a mortgage. 1935, not 1700. Many of our parents were alive in 1935. Maybe they got a mortgage. If they were African American, they probably never did. So we wonder why black people live in certain neighborhoods. Well, my own story. When I was young, a kid, one of our big events was to go to the Iowa State Fair. My father fixed up the pickup truck, built extra sides on it, and built a second story. So it was like a 2-story pickup truck. And we kids stayed in the top level, and we went to the Iowa State Fair. We loved that fair. And what I remember, one of my earliest memories of thinking about race, was when we went to the cattle show ring. And in the cattle show ring, I used to show cattle myself. People walk around, with their cattle, And the thing I remembered, early on memory, is there was always in the show ring a black man with a bushel basket and a rake. And it was his job to go after the cattle who pooped there in the show ring and flick that poop into the basket. So I thought he was very good at it. Just like that. But did I then grow up thinking to myself, this is what African American people do? They flick shit to keep the show ring clean. People in our congregations, even in all-white congregations, have some memory like that has formed the way we think about people of a different race. We as preachers need to tell some of those stories so that people can see we are not all so innocent. I think we also need to stop insisting on our innocence, as in, my family never owned slaves. My great-grandfather came to this country from Sweden in 1871. He's written a diary, sailed into New York Harbor, and he said it was a beautiful day, so spring-like after he had left Sweden in the snow. He had no idea that he was sailing into a city and then going to the Middle West, to a country that was built lock, stock, and barrel on the exploited, unpaid labor of slaves. Iowa, too, not just the South. If you've never read this amazing piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates called The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic magazine a year ago, turned my world upside down. Made me say at the end of reading it, I have no idea how any black person has ever made it anywhere in the United States of America. He also has a book now, Between the World and Me, which is a wondrous book. But when my great-grandfather came in 1871, he did not know what Coates shares in his book, in his article in The Atlantic. He's quoting David Blight, who's a Yale historian. In 1860, just 10 years before my grandfather came, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together. Slaves were by far the single largest financial asset of property in the entire American economy. No wonder the South fought so hard. That's an amazing statistic. Worth more than all the railroads, all the manufacturing. Slaves were insured not to protect their lives, but because they were such an important investment. But what can we draw in our chalk? You know, guilt is maybe an important starting point, but it is not going to solve the problem. So to preach sermons, make people feel guilty about being white, well, frankly, they can't help being white. I can't help being white. That's who I am. It's my own skin. Otis Moss said we have to be authentically who we are, preach from our own place. What can we do? Can we share some dreams? Can we spin out some possibilities? I've often said to my students, and this is a very, very hard thing in a class on preaching for social transformation, I said somehow you have to help people see that hope is as tangible as despair. And that is like the newspapers are full of despair and not a whole lot of hope. So we have to help people have a vision beyond the newspapers. A lot of that vision comes from the Bible. I think we could do everything in our power to support affirmative action, which is always under assault. I think affirmative action, where you give a chance to people who have never had a chance, whether it's at college or in a construction company doing a government project, I think affirmative action is the closest we will ever come to reparations. We're not going to do reparations. I mean paying generations of black people for the exploited labor of their great-great-grandparents. It's not going to happen. And Ta-Nehisi Coates says it's not going to happen. But affirmative action, always under assault. Unfair, somebody got in, I didn't get in as a white person, unfair. Affirmative action is, I think, one way that we just make a tiny little scratch in the case for reparations. I think we can do everything in our power to support getting a number of African American students at Lutheran seminaries here and everywhere else. Because it is really, really hard to be the only black student at a seminary. And people have to do this all the time. Women have had to do it in a sense to be the only woman clergy person. Herb Chilstrom, I can remember him saying years ago that when he first became bishop of the Minnesota Synod, there were 500 pastors and one was a woman. Well, things have changed. Can we change our church? Can we really have a vision for a different kind of church that would have seminaries with many people of color? I think we can do everything in our power in our communities to strengthen and provide adequate funding for public schools. Everything we can. Everything we can. Most of the schools in St. Paul and Minneapolis are what they call minority schools. It's not that people of color are the minority, they are the majority in those schools. But do they get adequate funding compared to all the surrounding suburbs, all the wealthy neighborhoods? People say, unfair, we pay more taxes. Can we paint a vision of a different kind of world? Minneapolis Star and Tribune had an article not long ago about the income for black people in this state of Minnesota, now lower than the state of Mississippi. Well, our sermons ought to ask some questions about that. I'll tell you what was most daunting. The article itself was really pretty sobering. But if you read it online and read the comments after it, you will be sick to your stomach. Because what people said about African Americans was unconscionable, unethical, demeaning, and had no sense about that golden rule. Leave that on the refrigerator magnet, but don't live it in your lives. How can hope be as tangible as despair? The song I sing, I'm not going to sing, but the song I sing is a song we sang at worship this morning, that song that Mary sang, the Magnificat. It has a personal beginning. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. And then it goes on to talk about a world turned upside down, the powerful thrown down, and the lowly lifted up, the hungry fed with good things, and the rich sent away empty because they already had enough. And Mary sang that song when nothing had changed. This is the thing that gives me courage and hope. When her son was born in Luke 2, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled, and he didn't give a rip for her song. He had never heard it, but she sang it anyway. She sang it anyway, about a world turned upside down. She was not naive. She lived in that world. This is a song we are called to sing. Find a way wherever you are, in a congregation that doesn't want to hear this at all, or a congregation which is hungry for a word about the common good. Each of us in our own way, can preach this word. We can sing the blues. We can sing the Magnificat. We can give people a vision of hope greater than anything they have ever seen. So don't be hushed, except by the word of God. Thank you very much.